Hey folks, it's Marvin Cash, the host of The Articulate Fly, and we're back with another On the Salt with GotOne with Captain David Blinken. David, how are you doing?
I'm great, Marvin. How are you doing after all the shows and everything we've experienced the past couple of weeks?
Yeah, I was happy last weekend just to be home and not at the airport on a Thursday or a Friday.
Isn't that a great feeling? You get to go home, you get to crack a beer with friends, or more importantly, hang out with family and just relax.
Absolutely, and I was just shocked. I thought for sure I was going to get, some nasty bug traveling 3 weeks in a row, but knock on wood, I didn't. So I'm excited to be home, and we'll talk about this probably a little bit later on in the episode. But you've got a pretty extensive travel schedule coming up here in a couple months.
Yeah, I do, and at least most of those pursuits are outdoors. The only part I got to worry about is the airport.
Well, there you go. And, we kind of put our heads together before we started recording, and it's kind of funny. It sounds like, you and I both kind of have a similar ebb and flow to our life on the water. And so I'm kind of in that gearing up for fishing season. And it is, even though it's wet down here in the Southeast, it's getting warmer. So I noticed today that the red buds are starting to bloom. And, one thing we thought would be helpful to coach folks through is cleaning their fly lines.
Oh my gosh. I mean, it's like such a basic thing, but so many of us, take it for granted. I mean, I try to clean my lines at the end of the season, but invariably I'm just putting stuff away and I'm drying out the reels, and, something always falls by the wayside. So I'm like, you wake up one morning and you're like, oh my God, I'm fishing the day after tomorrow. So, I break out the terry cloth towel and maybe a little bit of ivory soap and a tub of warm water. And there I am with like 16 reels cleaning fly lines. And then, I'm rinsing the lines after a little bit of ivory soap and the terry cloth towel. And then I'm stripping them all out on the floor and letting them dry. And then, of course, then the next thing I realize is, wait a second, I want to add something to the line so they shoot even better. So then I'm taking out line dressing and whatever line dressing you use, the one the Royal Wolf has, or Cortland, or whichever manufacturer you use, Scientific Angler. And there I am, and I'm like putting paste on the line, or I'm, doing line speed or whatever. And then again, I've got 16 reels of fly line sitting around me, drying, so all that stuff stays on the line. It's kind of comical, but it's so incredibly important to your fly fishing experience to have a nice clean line. So when you're casting it, you're saying to yourself, I knew I was able to cast better than this in November. What happened? And and having a nice clean fly line, gives you that sensation.
Yeah, and is there anything, David, I kind of come at it from the trout world. Is there anything you do to clean and dress lines in the saltwater that you would do differently than, say, for a trout line?
No, I pretty much do the same thing. It's maybe a little mild soap and water to get whatever grit, if it's on there with a little oily residue, off, and then certainly rinsing any soapy product off the line. It's really important. And I do like pulling my lines through a dry terry cloth towel at the end of that, just to remove any additional grit. And then it's just the line dressing of your choice, and then letting that dry. And I usually don't pull it through terry cloth or anything, after that. I have these little rectangular boxes with these pads on them that you can get from whoever owns Fire, Royal Wolf, or whoever. And when I do the line dressing, I'm usually, pulling the line through those little boxes, and it does the trick very nicely. And cleaning line also increases the life of your fly line. If you leave a lot of saltwater residue on your fly line, even though it's plastic and it's protected with various chemicals, whatever they use, better living through chemistry. It's always better to take those things, the salt off your fly line. And with the freshwater lines, I probably don't do as much, with my trout. I'll still clean it and make sure there's no grit, but I'll dress the line before I throw it back on the reel. It's a good idea.
Yeah. And do you, I would assume you probably rinse your reels off every time you go out, right?
after every session, and when I'm rinsing the boat in the trailer, the reels get a good rinse. And of course, my rods and reels remain on my boat all the time, so they're air drying overnight. And I'm usually in 4 or 5 in the afternoon, so they get a quick wash down. The reels probably get a better wash down than the rods, but fortunately with the rods I'm using, I've nickel titanium guides, so they don't corrode, so I don't have to worry so much about that. But the reels and the lines, it's very important. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. And I guess, the only thing I can kind of add is to use incredibly mild soap. I use bar ivory soap because, the last thing you want to do is to use something that's like, will take the pattern off your china, because
Yeah.
it'll do bad things to your fly line.
Yeah, I mean that's why I'll use liquid ivory or maybe like a drop of Dawn or palm olive, and I don't use a lot. I don't want it like super smudgy. I just want it enough to just lift the grit off the line, if whatever it is. And certainly with saltwater, warm water really makes a big difference for dissolving that salt.
Yeah, absolutely. And got an interesting question for you for this episode too, David, about we'll shift from fly lines to your advice for spotting fish on the flats.
Wow. Well, that is such a great question. And spotting fish on the flats is really interesting because some people come by it naturally and see, but I mean, the most important thing is having a good pair of polarized glasses first and foremost. And I would say if you're fishing inshore or certainly in a stream, I kind of like the ambers and the browns. They really they cut down not just on the polarized, not just doesn't cut down on the reflected light, but the ambers and browns also cut out that spectrum, that color spectrum that makes it sometimes a little more difficult to see fish. So that's the first thing you got to do. And the next thing is, and it's something I noticed with a lot of my clients after they've had the winter off, is they're not seeing fish as well as they were at the end of the season. And that's simply because, like any muscle, you've got to exercise that 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 ability to spot. You got to kind of sit back and take the time to look at a fish and kind of get your brain reacclimated to seeing something that almost perfectly matches its environment and be able to see them. Um, in different water depth, they look different. And of course, bonefish and stripers are much different. The other thing you want to get used to is not necessarily looking for the fish, but looking for the shadows. Um, because very often you can't see the fish. They're so mirrored that you're actually looking for the shadow, going across the bottom. Um, and and I would just say, in many ways, sort of the long and short of it is, it's practice makes perfect. Um, when I have a client who's never sight fished before, but they're a reasonably good fly angler, I will sometimes say to them, "We're not fishing yet." And they'll be like, "What?" I'm like, "No, I want to teach you how to see the fish so that when I'm saying there's a fish at 60 feet at 9 o'clock, you actually know what you're looking for." And that is kind of part of the education of fly fishing with me, and I assume some other guides probably do the same thing. I don't think I'm unique in that area, but helping people understand what they're looking for and how they're looking for it. And the other thing you never want to do when you're sight fishing is you don't want to stare at one particular spot in the water. Really, sight fishing, you're scanning and you're looking for some movement that's different than what you're seeing in relationship to features on the bottom. So if I'm fishing a rocky bottom and there's like 5 or 6 different rocks in a white sandy area, and suddenly I see something move within that area, that's probably a pretty good cue that there's a fish. So looking at things in relation to and in relationship to other things is also very helpful. Um, um, the harder bottoms to see things are grassy bottoms or things with variable colors, or cobbly bottoms are very hard to see things. More uniform bottoms certainly make it easier to see things. And other areas are like, I like fishing areas where there's grass and then there's white holes between the grass. And very often the fish are kind of laying in wait in those white holes. And sometimes it's easier to see them in those areas as they're waiting to ambush fish as they come, off, bait fish as they come off the grass. So that's kind of the 3-minute education on sight fishing and spotting fish.
Yeah, and so I would imagine you probably also like to block side light with either kind of closed sunglasses or hoodies. Is that something you like to do?
No, I don't necessarily do it. I think it's important to have a hat with a dark brim underneath, because you don't want additional reflected light coming up into your face. That makes it very difficult. I've never used side blockers on any of my glasses. I know some people that do. But normally we're fishing with the light, as straight overhead as possible. But I'll tell you something that is interesting, that's kind of related in a way, is sometimes you'll be out there and depending on the angle of the sun, cocking your head left or right will give you better sight line into the water. Just like pivoting a polarizer on a camera. And you'll notice that when you're pivoting a polarizer in a camera, you're looking through it, you're going to see things differently. And the same thing can happen when we're out fly fishing, and I'll have slightly lower light, and if I tip my head left or right, that kind of opens up my world a little more, looking down into the water. And it's very helpful. But normally when the sun is like kind of straight overhead, from like 10 in the morning till like 3 in the afternoon, you don't need to do that quite as much. But in the earlier hours and later hours, certainly that tipping of your head, like twisting a polarizer on a camera, really does go a long way.
Yeah, it's funny you say that. I'm a huge fan. I always carry a long brimmed Sims hat that always has the black underside on the bill, and I think it's invaluable.
It is. I've actually, there's certain hats I used to love wearing, but they weren't dark underneath. So I used to go buy these Sharpies that were like gloss, and I would just color the whole bottom.
Well, there you go. While you're listening to Pink Floyd, right? So,
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I would just do it, the whole thing black. It was great.
yeah.
And I have a nice, like, all my Patagonia hats. They're very smart. All my Patagonia fishing hats have dark undersides. And most of the hats made by, like, there's a company called Andes, and they make wonderful fishing hats with long brims, and they have dark undersides too. And like, the Quaker Marine sword fishing hats and all that. They're, all those guys have made hats specifically for being out on the water. So, it works out very nicely. I mean, like my New York Giants hat, no, can't wear it fishing.
Yeah, it's probably got a green underside. And I would tell you, I have a pair of Sunrise Silver Maracostas that are amber that I think are the bomb for low light fishing.
Yeah, I love my Costas for that too. And I have different I have different densities or colors with some of them. I wear glass primarily, but Costa does some really additional wavelengths of light. So on those exceedingly bright days, a little bit of mirroring can go a long way, man, and save and also help your eyes out. And then I've got other lenses that are not and normally I prefer to wear something that's not mirrored, just because I want things to appear a little brighter, and that's my preference. But it can't hurt to experiment with different color densities and mirrored versus not, and see how that works for you. But I can't emphasize enough just being out there and practicing, almost like going to the gym and just getting used to what you're seeing, and that will really help a huge amount. It's not just glasses, but it's also you.
Yeah, you got to go fish more, which is a great answer to any question.
Yeah.
So,
Just being out there.
yeah. And, folks, we love questions on the articulate fly. You can email me or DM me on social media. As I always say, let's make David's life a little bit easier. And to remind you guys, if you send in a question, we're going to enter in a drawing for a Rise Fishing Company rod. And then if we use your question, we're going to draw from those folks, and you're going to have the chance to win a Norvise system, which I think is a pretty killer opportunity.
It is. And we're going to have Tim on Masters of the Fly on February 25th. And that's going to be pretty exciting. We're going to get to watch him use Norvise. But more importantly, we want to see what Tim's going to come up with to tie.
Yeah, absolutely. And, the Norvise folks, I want to thank them for sponsoring the series, but they'll probably be executive platinum by the end of show season because they are going everywhere. And I think, the next two big shows for them that are coming up are Bellevue and Pleasanton, but they're, if Tim and Michelle aren't going to be there, they've got all kinds of ambassadors all over the country. If you go to www.nor-vice.com, you'll see all of their upcoming shows listed. And, you owe it to yourself either to watch the Masters of the Fly episode if you can't get to Tim and Michelle in person, or meet them at a show, because I do think that the Norvise is a very special tying product, and, you need to see it to kind of believe what it can do for you at the Vice.
Well, it is a cool Vice, I got to say.
Well, listen, folks, we're kind of in an interesting season. It's warm and wet here in the Southeast. You're getting ready to get a foot of snow where David is, but, if you can't get out, tie some flies or go to a fly fishing show, or if you're lucky enough, get out on the water and catch some early season trout or whatever you like to chase on the fly. Tight lines, everybody.
Tight lines.